The Battle of Chickamauga, a comprehensive analysis. The Battle of Chickamauga, fought from September 18 to September 20, 1863, was one of the most significant engagements of the American Civil War. It marked the end of the Union's Chickamauga campaign and was the most significant Union defeat in the Western theater. The battle took place in the forests and fields of northwest Georgia, near the Chickamauga Creek, from which the battle derives its name. This article aims to provide a comprehensive analysis of the Battle of Chickamauga, exploring its causes, key events, major figures, and its impact on the Civil War and American history. Background and causes. The strategic importance of Chattanooga. To understand the Battle of Chickamauga, one must first appreciate the strategic importance of Chattanooga, Tennessee. Chattanooga was a vital railroad hub, often referred to as the gateway to the Deep South. Control of Chattanooga would allow the Union to launch further invasions into Georgia and the heart of the Confederacy. Conversely, for the Confederacy, holding Chattanooga was crucial to maintaining their defensive line and protecting their supply routes. The Chickamauga Campaign. The Chickamauga Campaign was part of a broader Union strategy to seize control of Chattanooga and disrupt Confederate supply lines. Major General William S. Rosecrans, commanding the Union Army of the Cumberland, had successfully maneuvered Confederate General Braxton Bragg out of Middle Tennessee and forced him to retreat to Chattanooga. Rosecrans' plan was to outflank Bragg and force him to abandon Chattanooga without a fight. However, Bragg was determined to hold the city. He received reinforcements from General James Longstreet's corps, which had been sent from the Army of Northern Virginia. This bolstered Bragg's Army of Tennessee, setting the stage for a major confrontation, the prelude to battle. As Rosecrans advanced towards Chattanooga, Bragg decided to abandon the city and lure the Union forces into a trap. He withdrew his army to the south, allowing Rosecrans to occupy Chattanooga. Believing that Bragg was in full retreat, Rosecrans pursued the Confederate army into Georgia, spreading his forces thin in the process. Bragg, however, was not retreating. He had concentrated his forces and was waiting for an opportunity to strike. The two armies eventually clashed along the banks of Chickamauga Creek, a tributary of the Tennessee River. The stage was set for one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. The armies and commanders. The Union Army of the Cumberland. The Union Army of the Cumberland was commanded by Major General William S. Rosecrans, a capable and experienced officer. Rosecrans had previously achieved success at the Battle of Stones River and was known for his meticulous planning and attention to detail. However, his cautious nature sometimes led to missed opportunities. The Army of the Cumberland was composed of 3 corps, 14 Corps, commanded by Major General George H. Thomas, known as the Rock of Chickamauga for his steadfast defense during the battle. XX Corps, commanded by Major General Alexander M.C.D. McCook. XXI Corps, commanded by Major General Thomas L. Crittenden. In total, the Union forces numbered around 60,000 men. The Confederate Army of Tennessee. The Confederate Army of Tennessee was commanded by General Braxton Bragg, a controversial figure known for his abrasive personality and strained relationships with his subordinates. Despite these issues, Bragg was a skilled strategist and had the advantage of fighting on familiar terrain. The Army of Tennessee was reinforced by General James Longstreet's corps, which had been sent from the Army of Northern Virginia. Longstreet's arrival brought much-needed experience and leadership to the Confederate forces. The Confederate Army was organized into 2 wings. 1. Right wing, commanded by Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk, a former bishop turned soldier. 2. Left wing, commanded by Lieutenant General Daniel Harvey Hill. In total, the Confederate forces numbered around 65,000 men. The Battle of Chickamauga, Day 1, September 18, 1863. Initial skirmishes. The Battle of Chickamauga began on September 18, 1863, with a series of skirmishes along Chickamauga Creek. Both armies were maneuvering for position, and the dense forests and rugged terrain made coordination difficult. The Confederate forces attempted to cross the creek and outflank the Union Army, but they were met with stiff resistance. The Union defense. The Union forces, under the command of Major General George H. Thomas, established a strong defensive position along the Lafayette Road. Thomas, known for his calm demeanor under pressure, was instrumental in holding the Union line together during the early stages of the battle. As the Confederates pressed their attack, the Union forces were able to repel several assaults, thanks in part to the rugged terrain and the determined resistance of Thomas's men. However, the Confederate forces continued to probe the Union line, searching for weaknesses. The arrival of Longstreet. One of the most significant developments on the first day of the battle was the arrival of General James Longstreet and his corps. Longstreet's troops had traveled by rail from Virginia and arrived just in time to reinforce Bragg's army. Their presence would prove decisive in the coming days. As night fell on September 18, both armies prepared for the next day's fighting. The stage was set for a full-scale battle, with both sides determined to achieve victory. The Battle of Chickamauga, Day 2, September 19, 1863. The Confederate plan. On the morning of September 19, General Bragg devised a plan to attack the Union left flank and drive the Union forces back towards Chattanooga. He ordered General Leonidas Polk to lead the assault, with General Longstreet's corps in support. However, coordination between the Confederate commanders was poor, and the attack was delayed. This gave the Union forces time to reinforce their positions and prepare for the coming assault. The Union counterattack. As the Confederate forces finally began their attack, the Union forces launched a counterattack of their own. Major General George H. Thomas, commanding the Union left flank, ordered his men to advance and engage the Confederates. The fighting was fierce, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The dense forests and underbrush made it difficult for the armies to maintain formation, and the battle quickly devolved into a series of disjointed skirmishes. Despite the chaos, Thomas's men held their ground and prevented the Confederates from breaking through the Union line. The Confederate breakthrough. As the day wore on, the Confederate forces began to gain the upper hand. General Longstreet's corps, which had been held in reserve, was finally committed to the battle. Longstreet's troops launched a massive assault on the Union center, which had been weakened by the earlier fighting. The Union line began to crumble under the weight of the Confederate attack. Major General Alexander M.C.D. McCook's XX Corps was particularly hard hit, and many of his men fled the field in panic. The Confederate forces exploited the gap in the Union line and began to roll up the Union flank. The Union collapsed. As the Confederate forces pressed their advantage, the Union Army began to collapse. Major General Rosecrans, believing that the battle was lost, ordered a general retreat. However, not all of the Union forces followed this order. Major General George H. Thomas, commanding the Union left flank, refused to retreat. He rallied his men and established a strong defensive position on Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge. Thomas's determined defense earned him the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga and allowed the rest of the Union Army to retreat in relative safety. The aftermath of Day 2. By the end of the second day of fighting, the Confederate forces had achieved a significant victory. They had driven the Union Army from the field and inflicted heavy casualties. However, the Union forces under Thomas's command had managed to hold their ground and prevent a complete rout. The battle had been one of the bloodiest of the Civil War, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The Union Army had been forced to retreat, but they had not been destroyed. The stage was set for the final day of the Battle of Chickamauga, Day 3, September 20, 1863. The Confederate pursuit. On the morning of September 20, General Bragg ordered his forces to pursue the retreating Union Army. However, the Confederate forces were disorganized and exhausted from the previous day's fighting. Coordination between the Confederate commanders was poor, and the pursuit was slow and ineffective. The Union defense. As the Confederate forces advanced, they encountered the Union forces under Major General George H. Thomas, who had established a strong defensive position on Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge. Thomas's men were determined to hold their ground and prevent the Confederates from achieving a complete victory. The fighting on the third day was intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Union forces, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, managed to hold their position and repel several Confederate assaults. The Union retreat. As the day wore on, it became clear that the Union forces could not hold their position indefinitely. Major General Thomas ordered a gradual withdrawal, and the Union forces began to retreat towards Chattanooga. The retreat was conducted in good order, and the Union Army managed to escape without being destroyed. The end of the battle. By the evening of September 20, the Battle of Chickamauga was over. The Confederate forces had achieved a significant victory, but they had failed to destroy the Union Army. The Union forces had been forced to retreat, but they had managed to hold their ground and prevent a complete rout. The battle had been one of the bloodiest of the Civil War, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Union Army had lost around 16,000 men, while the Confederate forces had lost around 18,000. The battle had been a tactical victory for the Confederates, but it had not been a decisive one. Key figures and their roles. Major General William S. Rosecrans. Major General William S. Rosecrans was the commander of the Union Army of the Cumberland. He was a capable and experienced officer, but his cautious nature sometimes led to missed opportunities. During the Battle of Chickamauga, Rosecrans made several critical mistakes, including misjudging the strength and position of the Confederate forces. His decision to retreat on the second day of the battle was controversial, but it ultimately saved the Union Army from complete destruction. Major General George H. Thomas. Major General George H. Thomas, known as the Rock of Chickamauga, was one of the most important Union commanders during the battle. Thomas's steadfast defense on the second day of the battle prevented the Union Army from being routed and allowed the rest of the army to retreat in relative safety. His leadership and determination earned him the respect of his men and his superiors. General Braxton Bragg. General Braxton Bragg was the commander of the Confederate Army of Tennessee. He was a skilled strategist, but his abrasive personality and strained relationships with his subordinates often hindered his effectiveness. During the Battle of Chickamauga, Bragg's poor coordination and indecisiveness allowed the Union Army to escape destruction. Despite achieving a tactical victory, Bragg's failure to follow up on his success ultimately weakened the Confederate position in the Western Theater. General James Longstreet. General James Longstreet was one of the most experienced and capable Confederate commanders. He had been sent from the Army of Northern Virginia to reinforce Bragg's army, and his arrival proved decisive during the Battle of Chickamauga. Longstreet's corps launched the assault that broke the Union center and forced the Union Army to retreat. However, Longstreet's relationship with Bragg was strained, and his efforts to follow up on the Confederate victory were hampered by Bragg's indecisiveness. The aftermath and impact of the battle. The Siege of Chattanooga. Following the Battle of Chickamauga, the Union Army retreated to Chattanooga, where they were besieged by the Confederate forces. The Siege of Chattanooga lasted for several weeks, during which the Union Army faced severe shortages of food and supplies. However, the Union forces were eventually reinforced, and the siege was lifted following the Battle of Chattanooga in November 1863. The impact on the Civil War. The Battle of Chickamauga was a significant turning point in the Civil War. It marked the end of the Union's Chickamauga campaign and was the most significant Union defeat in the Western Theater. However, the Confederate victory was not decisive, and the Union Army managed to escape destruction. The battle also highlighted the importance of strong leadership and coordination, as the Confederate forces' failure to follow up on their success ultimately weakened their position in the Western Theater. The human cost. The Battle of Chickamauga was one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Union Army lost around 16,000 men, while the Confederate forces lost around 18,000. The battle had a profound impact on the soldiers who fought in it, many of whom were traumatized by the experience. The high casualty rate also had a significant impact on the communities from which the soldiers came, as many families lost loved ones in the fighting. The legacy of the battle. The Battle of Chickamauga has left a lasting legacy in American history. It is remembered as one of the most significant battles of the Civil War and is often studied by military historians for its tactical and strategic lessons. The battle also had a profound impact on the soldiers who fought in it, many of whom went on to play important roles in the later stages of the Civil War. The battlefield itself has been preserved as the Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park, which was established in 1890. The park is a popular destination for tourists and history enthusiasts, and it serves as a reminder of the sacrifices made by the soldiers who fought in the battle. The Battle of Chickamauga was one of the most significant engagements of the American Civil War. It marked the end of the Union's Chickamauga campaign and was the most significant Union defeat in the Western Theater. The battle was characterized by fierce fighting, heavy casualties, and poor coordination on both sides. Despite achieving a tactical victory, the Confederate forces failed to follow up on their success, and the Union Army managed to escape destruction. The battle had a profound impact on the Civil War and American history. It highlighted the importance of strong leadership and coordination, and it demonstrated the human cost of war. The legacy of the Battle of Chickamauga continues to be felt today, as the battlefield is preserved as a national park and serves as a reminder of the sacrifices made by the soldiers who fought in the battle. In conclusion, the Battle of Chickamauga was a pivotal moment in the Civil War, and its impact can still be felt today. It is a testament to the bravery and determination of the soldiers who fought in it, and it serves as a reminder of the high cost of war. The battle is a significant chapter in American history, and it continues to be studied and remembered by historians and enthusiasts alike. The Battle of Chickamauga, a comprehensive analysis of the Union's key strategic mistakes. The Battle of Chickamauga, fought from September 18 to 20, 1863, near Chickamauga Creek in Georgia, stands as one of the most significant engagements of the American Civil War. It was the second bloodiest battle of the war, with over 34,000 casualties, and marked a rare Confederate victory in the Western Theater. The Union Army of the Cumberland, led by Major General William S. Rosecrans, faced off against the Confederate Army of Tennessee, commanded by General Braxton Bragg. Despite initial successes in the Chickamauga campaign, which had pushed Confederate forces out of Chattanooga, the Union suffered a devastating defeat at Chickamauga. This article delves into the key strategic mistakes made by the Union during the battle, examining the decisions, miscommunications, and tactical errors that led to their downfall. Overextension and fragmentation of forces. One of the most critical strategic mistakes made by the Union during the Battle of Chickamauga was the overextension and fragmentation of their forces. In the weeks leading up to the battle, Rosecrans had successfully maneuvered his army to force Bragg's Confederates out of Chattanooga without a major fight. However, this success led to overconfidence and a lack of urgency in consolidating his forces. Failure to concentrate forces. Rosecrans' Army of the Cumberland was divided into 3 corps, each operating independently across a wide front. This dispersal of forces made it difficult for the Union to respond quickly to Confederate movements. As Bragg concentrated his forces near Chickamauga Creek, Rosecrans failed to recognize the imminent threat and did not consolidate his corps in time. This lack of concentration left the Union vulnerable to being overwhelmed by the Confederate Army, which had effectively concentrated its forces for a decisive blow. Miscommunication and delayed reinforcements. The fragmented nature of the Union forces also led to significant miscommunication. For example, Major General George H. Thomas's 14th Corps was delayed in reinforcing the Union left flank due to poor coordination and unclear orders. This delay allowed the Confederates to exploit gaps in the Union line, leading to the eventual collapse of their position on the second day of the battle. Underestimation of Confederate strength and intentions. Another major strategic error was the Union's underestimation of the Confederate Army's strength and intentions. Rosecrans and his staff believed that Bragg's forces were demoralized and in retreat following their withdrawal from Chattanooga. This assumption led to a lack of preparedness and a failure to anticipate the aggressive Confederate counteroffensive. Failure to conduct adequate reconnaissance. The Union's reconnaissance efforts were inadequate, leading to a poor understanding of the Confederate Army's movements and intentions. Rosecrans relied on incomplete and inaccurate intelligence, which failed to detect the concentration of Confederate forces near Chickamauga Creek. This lack of information contributed to the Union's inability to respond effectively to the Confederate attack, ignoring warning signs. Despite reports from scouts and cavalry units indicating a significant Confederate presence, Rosecrans dismissed these warnings, believing them to be exaggerated. This overconfidence and disregard for potential threats left the Union Army unprepared for the scale and intensity of the Confederate assault. Poor positioning and defensive planning. The Union's defensive positioning and planning were also flawed, contributing to their defeat at Chickamauga. Rosecrans' decision to establish a defensive line along Lafayette Road left his forces vulnerable to being outflanked and overwhelmed by the Confederate Army. Vulnerable flanks. The Union's defensive line was stretched thin, with insufficient forces to cover the flanks. This vulnerability was exploited by the Confederates, who launched a series of attacks aimed at turning the Union left flank. The failure to secure the flanks allowed the Confederates to penetrate the Union line and create chaos in their ranks. Inadequate use of terrain. The Union's defensive positions were not well suited to the terrain. The dense woods and uneven ground around Chickamauga Creek made it difficult for Union forces to maintain cohesion and communicate effectively. The Confederates, on the other hand, used the terrain to their advantage, launching surprise attacks and exploiting gaps in the Union line. Leadership failures and command disunity. Leadership failures and a lack of unity among Union commanders also played a significant role in the defeat at Chickamauga. Rosecrans' indecisiveness and poor communication with his subordinates created confusion and hindered the Union's ability to respond effectively to the Confederate assault. Rosecrans' indecisiveness. Rosecrans' leadership during the battle was marked by indecisiveness and a lack of clear direction. He frequently changed his plans and issued conflicting orders, leading to confusion among his subordinates. This lack of decisive leadership contributed to the Union's inability to mount a coordinated defense. Command disunity. There was also a lack of unity among Union commanders, particularly between Rosecrans and his corps commanders. Major General Thomas Crittenden and Major General Alexander McCook, commanders of the XX and XXI Corps respectively, were often at odds with Rosecrans, leading to a breakdown in coordination and cooperation. This disunity further weakened the Union's ability to respond effectively to the Confederate attack. Failure to adapt to changing circumstances. The Union's inability to adapt to the changing circumstances of the battle was another critical strategic mistake. As the battle progressed, the Union failed to adjust their tactics and strategies to counter the Confederate assault, leading to their eventual collapse. Rigid tactical doctrine. The Union's reliance on rigid tactical doctrine hindered their ability to respond effectively to the fluid and dynamic nature of the battle. Union commanders were slow to adapt to the changing battlefield conditions, leading to a series of costly mistakes and missed opportunities. Lack of flexibility. The Union's lack of flexibility was particularly evident in their response to the Confederate breakthrough on the second day of the battle. Instead of regrouping and launching a counterattack, Union forces became disorganized and retreated in confusion. This failure to adapt to the changing circumstances of the battle allowed the Confederates to exploit their advantage and secure a decisive victory. Logistical and supply issues. Logistical and supply issues also contributed to the Union's defeat at Chickamauga. The Union Army supply lines were stretched thin, and they faced significant challenges in maintaining adequate provisions and ammunition for their forces. Stretched supply lines. The Union's rapid advance into Georgia had stretched their supply lines, making it difficult to maintain adequate provisions and ammunition for their forces. This logistical challenge was exacerbated by the difficult terrain and poor roads, which hindered the movement of supplies to the front lines. Ammunition shortages. During the battle, Union forces faced critical shortages of ammunition, particularly on the second day. This shortage severely hampered their ability to sustain their defense and contributed to the collapse of their position. The lack of adequate supplies and logistical support was a significant factor in the Union's defeat. Psychological and morale factors. Psychological and morale factors also played a role in the Union's defeat at Chickamauga. The intense and brutal nature of the fighting, combined with the high casualties, took a toll on the morale of Union soldiers. High casualties and fatigue. The Union Army suffered heavy casualties during the battle, particularly on the second day. The intense fighting and high losses led to a decline in morale and a sense of despair among Union soldiers. This psychological toll contributed to the breakdown of discipline and cohesion in the Union ranks. Loss of confidence in leadership. The Union's defeat at Chickamauga also led to a loss of confidence in Rosecrans' leadership. Many soldiers and officers blamed Rosecrans for the defeat, citing his indecisiveness and poor decision-making. This loss of confidence further weakened the Union's ability to recover from the defeat and regroup for future engagements. Missed opportunities for counterattacks. Throughout the battle, the Union missed several opportunities to launch counterattacks that could have turned the tide in their favor. These missed opportunities were often the result of poor coordination, indecisiveness, and a lack of aggressive leadership. Failure to exploit Confederate mistakes. The Confederates made several mistakes during the battle, including disjointed attacks and poor coordination between their own units. However, the Union failed to exploit these mistakes, often due to a lack of initiative and aggressive leadership. This failure to capitalize on Confederate errors allowed the Confederates to maintain their momentum and ultimately secure victory. Lack of aggressive leadership. The Union's lack of aggressive leadership was particularly evident in their response to the Confederate breakthrough on the second day. Instead of launching a counterattack to regain lost ground, Union forces became disorganized and retreated in confusion. This lack of aggressive leadership and initiative contributed to the Union's defeat. Impact of the Union's defeat at Chickamauga. The Union's defeat at Chickamauga had significant strategic and psychological consequences for the rest of the Civil War. The loss at Chickamauga halted the Union's advance into Georgia and allowed the Confederates to regain the initiative in the Western Theater. Strategic consequences. The defeat at Chickamauga forced the Union to abandon their plans to capture Atlanta and cut off the Confederacy's supply lines. Instead, they were forced to retreat to Chattanooga, where they faced a prolonged siege. This setback delayed the Union's eventual victory in the Western Theater and prolonged the war. Psychological impact. The Union's defeat at Chickamauga also had a significant psychological impact on both sides. For the Confederates, the victory at Chickamauga boosted morale and reinforced their belief in the possibility of ultimate victory. For the Union, the defeat was a demoralizing blow that led to a loss of confidence in their leadership and strategy. Lessons learned from the Union's mistakes. The Union's defeat at Chickamauga offers several important lessons for military strategy and leadership. These lessons highlight the importance of concentration of forces, effective reconnaissance, decisive leadership, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Concentration of forces. One of the key lessons from Chickamauga is the importance of concentrating forces to achieve decisive results. The Union's failure to consolidate their forces left them vulnerable to being overwhelmed by the concentrated Confederate army. This lesson underscores the need for unity of effort and the importance of maintaining a cohesive and concentrated force. Effective reconnaissance. The Union's inadequate reconnaissance efforts at Chickamauga highlight the importance of accurate and timely intelligence in military operations. Effective reconnaissance is essential for understanding the enemy's strength, intentions, and movements, and for making informed decisions on the battlefield. Decisive leadership. The Union's defeat at Chickamauga also underscores the importance of decisive leadership in military operations. Rosecrans' indecisiveness and poor communication with his subordinates contributed to the Union's inability to respond effectively to the Confederate assault. This lesson highlights the need for clear and decisive leadership in times of crisis. Adaptability and flexibility. Finally, the Union's inability to adapt to the changing circumstances of the battle at Chickamauga highlights the importance of adaptability and flexibility in military operations. The ability to adjust tactics and strategies in response to changing battlefield conditions is essential for achieving success in combat. The Battle of Chickamauga was a pivotal engagement in the American Civil War, marked by significant strategic mistakes on the part of the Union. The overextension and fragmentation of forces, underestimation of Confederate strength, poor positioning and defensive planning, leadership failures, and inability to adapt to changing circumstances all contributed to the Union's defeat. These mistakes offer important lessons for military strategy and leadership, emphasizing the importance of concentration of forces, effective reconnaissance, decisive leadership, and adaptability in achieving success on the battlefield. The Union's defeat at Chickamauga had significant strategic and psychological consequences, but it also provided valuable insights that would shape the course of the war and influence military thought for generations to come. How the terrain of Chickamauga Creek influenced the outcome of the battle. The Battle of Chickamauga, fought from September 18 to 20, 1863, was one of the most significant engagements of the American Civil War. It marked the second bloodiest battle of the war, with over 34,000 casualties. The terrain surrounding Chickamauga Creek, a winding waterway in northwestern Georgia, played a pivotal role in shaping the strategies, movements, and ultimate outcome of the battle. This article explores how the physical features of the battlefield, its dense forests, rugged hills, and the creek itself, influenced the course of the conflict. The geography of Chickamauga Creek. Chickamauga Creek, a tributary of the Tennessee River, flows through a region characterized by dense woodlands, steep ridges, and narrow valleys. The creek itself was not a major obstacle in terms of width or depth, but its banks were often steep and lined with thick underbrush, making crossings difficult for large bodies of troops. The surrounding terrain was heavily forested, with few open fields, which limited visibility and made coordinated movements challenging. The battlefield was divided into two main areas: the eastern side, dominated by the creek and its tributaries, and the western side, which featured higher ground and more open terrain. The dense forests and uneven ground forced commanders to adapt their tactics, as traditional linear formations and cavalry charges were often impractical. Impact on troop movements. The dense woods and rugged terrain significantly slowed the movement of troops and artillery. Roads were few and often poorly maintained, making it difficult for both the Union and Confederate forces to maneuver. The Confederates, under General Braxton Bragg, were more familiar with the terrain, which gave them a slight advantage in navigating the battlefield. In contrast, the Union forces, led by General William Rosecrans, struggled to coordinate their movements due to the lack of visibility and the difficulty of maintaining communication between units. The terrain also made it difficult for commanders to maintain a clear picture of the battlefield. Miscommunication and confusion were common, leading to disjointed attacks and missed opportunities. For example, on the second day of the battle, a gap opened in the Union lines due to miscommunication, which the Confederates exploited to devastating effect. The role of the creek as a natural barrier. Chickamauga Creek served as a natural barrier that influenced the positioning and strategies of both armies. The Union forces initially used the creek as a defensive line, hoping to delay the Confederate advance. However, the Confederates managed to cross the creek at multiple points, using their knowledge of the terrain to find suitable fords and bridges. Once across, they were able to outflank the Union forces and force them into a defensive position. The creek also played a role in the final stages of the battle. As the Union lines collapsed, many soldiers retreated across the creek in disarray, with the steep banks and dense underbrush adding to the chaos. The Confederates, however, were unable to fully capitalize on their victory due to the difficulty of pursuing the retreating Union forces through the challenging terrain. The dense forests and limited visibility. The dense forests of the Chickamauga battlefield had a profound impact on the fighting. Visibility was often limited to a few yards, making it difficult for soldiers to see enemy positions or coordinate with adjacent units. This led to a series of disjointed and often brutal close-quarters engagements, with soldiers relying on sound rather than sight to locate the enemy. The forests also provided cover for both attackers and defenders, making it difficult for artillery to be effective. Artillery units were often forced to fire blindly into the woods, with limited success. The dense underbrush also made it difficult for cavalry to operate, further limiting the options available to commanders. The high ground and key terrain features. The western side of the battlefield featured higher ground, including Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge, which became critical during the final stages of the battle. As the Union lines collapsed, General George H. Thomas organized a defensive stand on these heights, earning him the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga. The rugged terrain made it difficult for the Confederates to dislodge the Union forces, allowing Thomas to hold his position long enough to cover the retreat of the rest of the Union Army. The high ground also provided a commanding view of the surrounding area, allowing Thomas to coordinate his defense more effectively. The Confederates, despite their numerical advantage, were unable to overcome the natural defenses provided by the terrain. Logistical challenges. The terrain also posed significant logistical challenges for both armies. Supplying troops with food, ammunition, and medical supplies was difficult due to the lack of roads and the dense forests. Wounded soldiers often had to be carried long distances to reach field hospitals, and the rough terrain made it difficult to evacuate them quickly. The Confederates, who were operating closer to their supply bases, had a slight advantage in this regard. However, the Union forces were able to use the terrain to their advantage during their retreat, as the dense forests and steep ridges slowed the Confederate pursuit. The terrain of Chickamauga Creek was a decisive factor in the outcome of the Battle of Chickamauga. The dense forests, rugged hills, and winding creek shaped the strategies and movements of both armies, often neutralizing the advantages of superior numbers or firepower. The Confederates' familiarity with the terrain allowed them to outmaneuver the Union forces and exploit gaps in their lines, while the Union's ability to use the high ground for a defensive stand prevented a complete rout. In the end, the Battle of Chickamauga was a tactical victory for the Confederates, but the challenging terrain prevented them from fully capitalizing on their success. The Union Army, though forced to retreat, lived to fight another day, and the lessons learned from the battle would influence future engagements in the Civil War. The role of General George H. Thomas in the Union's defense at Chickamauga. The Battle of Chickamauga, fought from September 19 to September 20, 1863, was one of the most significant engagements of the American Civil War. It marked the culmination of the Chickamauga Campaign, a series of maneuvers and battles between the Union Army of the Cumberland, commanded by Major General William S. Rosecrans, and the Confederate Army of Tennessee, led by General Braxton Bragg. The battle was fought in the dense forests and rugged terrain of northwest Georgia, near the Chickamauga Creek, and resulted in one of the bloodiest confrontations of the war, with over 34,000 casualties among the Union commanders. General George Henry Thomas emerged as a central figure whose leadership and tactical acumen played a crucial role in the Union's defense during the battle. Often referred to as the Rock of Chickamauga, Thomas's steadfastness and ability to hold the line against overwhelming Confederate forces prevented a complete Union rout and allowed the Army of the Cumberland to retreat in relative order. This article delves into the life, career, and pivotal role of General George H. Thomas in the Union's defense at Chickamauga, examining his strategic decisions, leadership qualities, and the lasting impact of his actions on the outcome of the battle and the broader Civil War. Early life and military career of George H. Thomas. Background and education. George Henry Thomas was born on July 31, 1816, in Southampton County, Virginia. He grew up in a slaveholding family, which was typical of the region's plantation economy. Despite his Southern roots, Thomas would later become one of the most loyal and effective Union generals during the Civil War. His early education was modest, but he showed an aptitude for learning and a strong sense of duty. In 1836, Thomas received an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. He graduated in 1840, ranking 12th in his class, and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 3rd U.S. Artillery. His classmates included several future Civil War generals, including William T. Sherman and Richard S. Ewell. Early military service. Thomas's early military career was marked by service in the Seminole Wars in Florida and the Mexican-American War. During the latter conflict, he distinguished himself in several key battles, including the battles of Monterey and Buena Vista. His performance earned him brevets, temporary promotions, for bravery and effective command. After the Mexican-American War, Thomas returned to West Point as an instructor, where he taught artillery and cavalry tactics. His time at the academy further honed his military skills and deepened his understanding of strategy and leadership. In the 1850s, he served in various posts across the United States, including in Texas and California, where he gained valuable experience in frontier warfare and logistics. The Civil War begins. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Thomas faced a difficult decision. As a Virginian, he was expected to side with the Confederacy, but his loyalty to the United States and his oath to the Constitution led him to remain with the Union. This decision alienated him from his family and many of his Southern peers, but it also earned him the trust and respect of his Union superiors. Thomas was promoted to brigadier general in August 1861 and assigned to command a brigade in the Department of the Cumberland. He quickly demonstrated his competence in organizing and training troops, as well as his ability to lead them effectively in battle. His early successes in Kentucky and Tennessee earned him further promotions and greater responsibilities within the Union Army. The Chickamauga Campaign. Strategic context. By the summer of 1863, the Union had achieved significant victories in the Western Theater, including the capture of Vicksburg and the control of the Mississippi River. However, the Confederate Army of Tennessee, under General Braxton Bragg, remained a formidable force in the region. The Union leadership, particularly General Rosecrans, sought to capitalize on their momentum by advancing into Georgia and capturing the key railroad hub of Chattanooga. The Chickamauga campaign was part of this broader strategy. Rosecrans's Army of the Cumberland maneuvered to outflank Bragg's forces and force them out of Chattanooga. Through a series of skillful movements, Rosecrans succeeded in pushing Bragg's army south into Georgia. However, Bragg was determined to counterattack and reclaim the initiative. Prelude to battle. As the two armies converged near Chickamauga Creek, the stage was set for a major confrontation. Bragg's Confederate forces were reinforced by troops from other theaters, including General James Longstreet's corps from the Army of Northern Virginia. This bolstered the Confederate numbers and morale, giving them a numerical advantage over the Union forces. Rosecrans, aware of the growing Confederate threat, sought to consolidate his forces and prepare for a defensive battle. However, his army was spread out over a wide area, and communication between his corps commanders was often slow and unreliable. This dispersion of forces would prove to be a critical weakness as the battle unfolded. The Battle of Chickamauga. Day 1, September 19, 1863. The Battle of Chickamauga began on the morning of September 19, 1863, with skirmishes between Union and Confederate forces along the banks of Chickamauga Creek. The dense forests and uneven terrain made coordination and visibility difficult for both sides, leading to a series of disjointed and often chaotic engagements. General Thomas's 14th Corps was positioned on the Union left flank, near the Kelly Farm. Throughout the day, Thomas's men faced repeated Confederate assaults, particularly from General John Bell Hood's division. Despite being outnumbered and under intense pressure, Thomas's troops held their ground, repelling multiple attacks and inflicting heavy casualties on the Confederates. Thomas's leadership during the first day of the battle was characterized by his calm demeanor, effective use of terrain, and ability to inspire his men. He personally directed the placement of artillery and the movement of reinforcements, ensuring that his lines remained intact despite the ferocity of the Confederate onslaught. Day 2, September 20, 1863. The second day of the battle proved to be even more intense and decisive. Bragg launched a massive assault on the Union lines, aiming to break through and envelop Rosecrans's army. The Confederate attack was led by Longstreet's corps, which had arrived on the battlefield the previous evening. Early in the morning, a miscommunication between Rosecrans and one of his corps commanders, Major General Thomas L. Crittenden, led to a gap opening in the Union center. Longstreet's forces exploited this gap, driving a wedge between the Union forces and causing widespread panic and confusion. Several Union divisions were routed, and the Union right flank collapsed. As the Union line disintegrated, Thomas's 14th Corps remained as the last organized Union force on the battlefield. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, Thomas rallied his men and established a defensive position on Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge. This position, which became known as Thomas's Stand, would become the focal point of the Union's defense. Thomas's stand at Horseshoe Ridge. For several hours, Thomas's men withstood relentless Confederate assaults. Despite being outnumbered and running low on ammunition, they held their ground, buying precious time for the rest of the Union Army to retreat to Chattanooga. Thomas's leadership during this critical phase of the battle was nothing short of heroic. He personally directed the defense, moving from one part of the line to another, encouraging his men, and ensuring that every available resource was used to its fullest potential. The fighting on Horseshoe Ridge was some of the most intense of the entire battle. Union soldiers, many of whom were exhausted and low on supplies, fought with determination and courage. Thomas's ability to maintain order and discipline under such dire circumstances was a testament to his skill as a commander and his unwavering commitment to his men. As the day wore on, Thomas's position became increasingly untenable. With no reinforcements available and the Confederates pressing their attacks, Thomas made the difficult decision to withdraw his forces. However, he did so in an orderly manner, ensuring that his men retreated in good order and with minimal additional losses. Aftermath and impact. Union retreat to Chattanooga. The Union retreat to Chattanooga was a somber affair, but it could have been far worse if not for Thomas's heroic defense at Horseshoe Ridge. His actions allowed the bulk of the Army of the Cumberland to escape and regroup, preserving the Union's presence in the region and setting the stage for future operations. The Battle of Chickamauga was a tactical victory for the Confederates, but it came at a high cost. Bragg's army suffered significant casualties and was unable to capitalize on its success. The Union forces, though battered, remained intact and would soon be reinforced by troops under General Ulysses S. Grant. Thomas's legacy at Chickamauga. General George H. Thomas's performance at Chickamauga earned him the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga, a testament to his steadfastness and reliability under pressure. His ability to hold the line against overwhelming odds and his skillful leadership during the retreat were critical in preventing a complete Union disaster. Thomas's actions at Chickamauga also had broader implications for the Union war effort. By preserving the Army of the Cumberland, he ensured that the Union maintained a strong presence in the Western theater, which would prove crucial in the subsequent campaigns that led to the eventual Union victory. Recognition and promotion. In the aftermath of Chickamauga, Thomas's reputation as one of the Union's most capable generals was firmly established. He was promoted to Major General in the regular army and given command of the Army of the Cumberland. His leadership would continue to be instrumental in the Union's success in the Western theater, particularly during the Chattanooga Campaign and the Atlanta Campaign. General George H. Thomas's role in the Union's defense at Chickamauga was pivotal. His leadership, tactical acumen, and unwavering determination were key factors in preventing a complete Union rout and ensuring the survival of the Army of the Cumberland. Thomas's actions at Chickamauga not only earned him the enduring nickname, the Rock of Chickamauga, but also solidified his place as one of the most respected and effective Union generals of the Civil War. The Battle of Chickamauga was a turning point in the Western theater, and Thomas's contributions were instrumental in shaping its outcome. His legacy as a steadfast and reliable commander continues to be celebrated, and his actions at Chickamauga remain a defining moment in his distinguished military career. Through his leadership and courage, General George H. Thomas exemplified the qualities of a true military hero, and his impact on the Union's defense at Chickamauga will be remembered for generations to come. The casualties at Chickamauga, a comparative analysis with other major battles of the American Civil War. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, was one of the most devastating conflicts in United States history, with an estimated 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers losing their lives. Among the many battles fought during this tumultuous period, the Battle of Chickamauga, September 19 to 20, 1863, stands out as one of the bloodiest and most significant engagements. This article aims to provide a comprehensive analysis of the casualties at Chickamauga and compare them to those of other major battles of the Civil War. By examining the human cost of these battles, we can gain a deeper understanding of the war's impact on the nation and its people. The Battle of Chickamauga. An overview. Background and context. The Battle of Chickamauga took place in northwestern Georgia, near the Chickamauga Creek, from September 19 to September 20, 1863. It was part of the larger Chickamauga Campaign, which was a Confederate attempt to halt the Union's advance into Georgia following their victory at the Battle of Chattanooga. The Confederate Army of Tennessee, commanded by General Braxton Bragg, faced off against the Union Army of the Cumberland, led by General William Rosecrans. The course of the battle began on September 19, with both sides engaging in fierce fighting. The Confederates launched a series of attacks, but the Union forces managed to hold their ground. On the second day, the Confederates launched a massive assault that broke through the Union lines, leading to a chaotic retreat. However, the Union forces managed to regroup and hold their position at Snodgrass Hill, preventing a complete rout. Casualties at Chickamauga. The Battle of Chickamauga was one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, with a total of approximately 34,624 casualties. This figure includes both killed, wounded, and missing soldiers. The Union forces suffered around 16,170 casualties, while the Confederates incurred approximately 18,454 casualties. The high number of casualties at Chickamauga was due to the intense and close-quarters combat that characterized the battle. Comparative analysis of casualties in major Civil War battles. To understand the significance of the casualties at Chickamauga, it is essential to compare them to those of other major battles of the Civil War. The following sections will provide an overview of the casualties in some of the most significant battles of the conflict, including the Battle of Gettysburg, the Battle of Antietam, the Battle of Shiloh, and the Battle of Fredericksburg. The Battle of Gettysburg, July 1 to 3, 1863. Background and context. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1 to July 3, 1863, in Pennsylvania, is often considered the turning point of the Civil War. It was the largest battle ever fought in North America, with over 165,000 soldiers engaged. The Union Army of the Potomac, commanded by General George G. Meade, faced off against the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, led by General Robert E. Lee. Casualties at Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg resulted in approximately 51,000 casualties, making it the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. The Union forces suffered around 23,000 casualties, while the Confederates incurred approximately 28,000 casualties. The high number of casualties at Gettysburg was due to the large scale of the battle and the intense fighting that took place over 3 days. Comparison with Chickamauga. While the Battle of Gettysburg had a higher total number of casualties than Chickamauga, the casualty rates, casualties as a percentage of total forces engaged, were somewhat similar. At Gettysburg, the casualty rate was approximately 31%, while at Chickamauga, it was around 28%. This indicates that both battles were exceptionally bloody, with a significant proportion of the forces engaged becoming casualties. The Battle of Antietam, September 17, 1862, background and context. The Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862, near Sharpsburg, Maryland, was the first major battle of the Civil War to take place on Union soil. It was also the bloodiest single-day battle in American history, with over 22,000 casualties. The Union Army of the Potomac, commanded by General George B. McClellan, faced off against the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, led by General Robert E. Lee. Casualties at Antietam. The Battle of Antietam resulted in approximately 22,717 casualties, with the Union forces suffering around 12,401 casualties and the Confederates incurring approximately 10,316 casualties. The high number of casualties at Antietam was due to the intense and concentrated fighting that took place over a single day. Comparison with Chickamauga. The Battle of Antietam had a lower total number of casualties than Chickamauga, but it was the bloodiest single-day battle of the Civil War. The casualty rate at Antietam was approximately 22%, which is lower than the casualty rate at Chickamauga, 28%. However, the intensity of the fighting at Antietam, concentrated in a single day, makes it one of the most devastating battles of the war. The Battle of Shiloh, April 6 to 7, 1862, background and context. The Battle of Shiloh, fought from April 6 to April 7, 1862, in southwestern Tennessee, was one of the early major battles of the Civil War. It was a significant Union victory that helped secure control of the Mississippi River Valley. The Union Army of the Tennessee, commanded by General Ulysses S. Grant, faced off against the Confederate Army of Mississippi, led by General Albert Sidney Johnston. Casualties at Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh resulted in approximately 23,746 casualties, with the Union forces suffering around 13,047 casualties and the Confederates incurring approximately 10,699 casualties. The high number of casualties at Shiloh was due to the large scale of the battle and the intense fighting that took place over 2 days. Comparison with Chickamauga. The Battle of Shiloh had a lower total number of casualties than Chickamauga, but it was still one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. The casualty rate at Shiloh was approximately 24%, which is slightly lower than the casualty rate at Chickamauga, 28%. However, the Battle of Shiloh was significant in that it marked a turning point in the war, demonstrating the ferocity and scale of the conflict. The Battle of Fredericksburg, December 11 to 15, 1862, background and context. The Battle of Fredericksburg, fought from December 11 to December 15, 1862, in Virginia, was a significant Confederate victory. It was part of the larger Fredericksburg campaign, which was an attempt by the Union Army of the Potomac, commanded by General Ambrose Burnside, to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, led by General Robert E. Lee, successfully defended their position. Casualties at Fredericksburg. The Battle of Fredericksburg resulted in approximately 17,929 casualties, with the Union forces suffering around 12,653 casualties and the Confederates incurring approximately 5,376 casualties. The high number of Union casualties at Fredericksburg was due to the failed frontal assaults on well-entrenched Confederate positions. Comparison with Chickamauga. The Battle of Fredericksburg had a lower total number of casualties than Chickamauga, but it was still a significant and costly battle. The casualty rate at Fredericksburg was approximately 13%, which is significantly lower than the casualty rate at Chickamauga, 28%. However, the Battle of Fredericksburg was notable for the high number of Union casualties, which were largely the result of poor tactical decisions. Factors influencing casualty rates in Civil War battles. The casualty rates in Civil War battles were influenced by a variety of factors, including the size of the forces engaged, the tactics employed, the terrain, and the effectiveness of medical care. The following sections will explore these factors in more detail. Size of forces engaged. The size of the forces engaged in a battle had a direct impact on the number of casualties. Larger battles, such as Gettysburg and Chickamauga, involved more soldiers and therefore had higher total numbers of casualties. However, the casualty rate, casualties as a percentage of total forces engaged, could vary depending on the intensity of the fighting and the effectiveness of the tactics employed. Tactics and strategy. The tactics and strategy employed by the commanders on both sides also played a significant role in determining casualty rates. For example, frontal assaults on well-entrenched positions, such as those at Fredericksburg, often resulted in high numbers of casualties. Conversely, battles that involved more maneuver and less direct confrontation, such as the Battle of Chancellorsville, tended to have lower casualty rates. The terrain on which a battle was fought could also influence casualty rates. Battles fought in open fields, such as Gettysburg, often resulted in higher casualty rates due to the lack of cover and the ability of artillery to inflict significant damage. Conversely, battles fought in more wooded or rugged terrain, such as Chickamauga, could result in lower casualty rates due to the difficulty of maneuvering large forces and the availability of cover. Medical care. The effectiveness of medical care during and after a battle also played a role in determining casualty rates. In the early years of the Civil War, medical care was often inadequate, leading to higher numbers of deaths from wounds and disease. As the war progressed, improvements in medical care, including the establishment of field hospitals and the use of anesthesia, helped to reduce the number of deaths from wounds. The human cost of the Civil War. The high number of casualties in battles such as Chickamauga, Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh, and Fredericksburg had a profound impact on the nation. The loss of life and the physical and psychological wounds suffered by the soldiers had long-lasting effects on the families and communities from which they came. The following sections will explore the human cost of the Civil War in more detail. Impact on families and communities. The loss of life in the Civil War had a devastating impact on families and communities across the nation. The death of a soldier meant the loss of a son, brother, husband, or father, leaving families to cope with the emotional and financial burden of their loss. In many cases, the death of a soldier also meant the loss of a primary breadwinner, leading to economic hardship for the surviving family members. Psychological impact on soldiers. The psychological impact of the Civil War on the soldiers who fought in it was also significant. Many soldiers suffered from what is now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, experiencing symptoms such as flashbacks, nightmares, and anxiety. The trauma of battle, combined with the harsh conditions of camp life and the constant threat of death, took a heavy toll on the mental health of the soldiers. Long-term effects on the nation. The high number of casualties in the Civil War had long-term effects on the nation as a whole. The loss of so many young men had a significant impact on the demographic structure of the country, leading to a shortage of labor and a slowdown in population growth. The war also left a legacy of bitterness and division that would take decades to heal, as the nation struggled to come to terms with the cost of the conflict. The Battle of Chickamauga was one of the bloodiest and most significant battles of the American Civil War, with a total of approximately 34,624 casualties. When compared to other major battles of the war, such as Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh, and Fredericksburg, the casualties at Chickamauga were among the highest, both in terms of total numbers and casualty rates. The high number of casualties in these battles was due to a combination of factors, including the size of the forces engaged, the tactics employed, the terrain, and the effectiveness of medical care. The human cost of the Civil War was immense, with the loss of life and the physical and psychological wounds suffered by the soldiers having a profound impact on families, communities, and the nation as a whole. The legacy of the war, including the high number of casualties, serves as a reminder of the sacrifices made by those who fought and died in the conflict. As we reflect on the casualties at Chickamauga and other major battles of the Civil War, we are reminded of the importance of understanding and remembering the human cost of war, and the need to strive for peace and reconciliation in the face of conflict. The long-term consequences of the Battle of Chickamauga for the Confederacy. The Battle of Chickamauga, fought from September 18 to 20, 1863, was one of the most significant engagements of the American Civil War. It was the largest battle fought in the Western Theater and the second deadliest battle of the entire war, with over 34,000 casualties. The Confederate Army of Tennessee, led by General Braxton Bragg, achieved a tactical victory over the Union Army of the Cumberland, commanded by General William Rosecrans. However, the long-term consequences of this battle for the Confederacy were far from favorable. This article will explore the multifaceted impacts of the Battle of Chickamauga on the Confederate war effort, including its military, political, economic, and social ramifications. Military consequences. Strategic stalemate and the Siege of Chattanooga. Although the Confederates won a tactical victory at Chickamauga, they failed to capitalize on their success. General Bragg's decision not to pursue the retreating Union forces allowed Rosecrans to regroup in Chattanooga, a critical transportation hub. The subsequent Siege of Chattanooga, which lasted from late September to late November 1863, ended in a decisive Union victory at the Battle of Missionary Ridge. This loss negated any strategic advantage the Confederates had gained at Chickamauga and opened the door for General William Tecumseh Sherman's Atlanta campaign in 1864. Erosion of Confederate leadership and morale. The Battle of Chickamauga exacerbated existing tensions within the Confederate High Command. General Bragg's leadership was widely criticized, leading to a series of disputes with his subordinates, including Generals James Longstreet and Leonidas Polk. These internal conflicts weakened the Army of Tennessee's cohesion and effectiveness. Additionally, the failure to achieve a decisive victory despite heavy casualties damaged morale among Confederate troops and civilians alike. Loss of key personnel. The battle resulted in significant casualties, including the loss of experienced officers and soldiers. The Confederacy, already struggling with manpower shortages, could ill afford these losses. The death or incapacitation of key leaders further hindered the Confederate war effort, as their expertise and leadership were difficult to replace. Political consequences. Diminished support for the Confederate caused the inability to secure a decisive victory at Chickamauga, and the subsequent loss of Chattanooga undermined confidence in the Confederate government. President Jefferson Davis faced increasing criticism for his handling of the war, particularly his support for General Bragg. This erosion of trust weakened the political cohesion of the Confederacy and made it more difficult to mobilize resources and support for the war effort. Impact on foreign relations. The Confederacy had long hoped for recognition and support from European powers, particularly Britain and France. However, the failure to achieve a decisive victory at Chickamauga and the loss of Chattanooga diminished the likelihood of foreign intervention. European observers viewed these setbacks as evidence that the Confederacy was unlikely to achieve independence, leading to a decline in diplomatic efforts to secure recognition. Economic consequences. Strain on resources. The Battle of Chickamauga and the subsequent siege of Chattanooga placed a significant strain on the Confederacy's already limited resources. The loss of Chattanooga, a key transportation hub, disrupted supply lines and hindered the movement of goods and troops. This further exacerbated the Confederacy's economic difficulties, including inflation, shortages of essential goods, and a collapsing currency. Impact on agriculture and industry. The battle and its aftermath disrupted agricultural and industrial production in the region. The destruction of infrastructure, including railroads and factories, hindered the Confederacy's ability to sustain its war effort. Additionally, the loss of Chattanooga and the surrounding area deprived the Confederacy of valuable resources, including food, raw materials, and manufactured goods. Social consequences. Civilian displacement and suffering. The Battle of Chickamauga and the subsequent military operations in the region caused widespread suffering among the civilian population. Many families were displaced and communities were devastated by the fighting. The loss of life, destruction of property, and disruption of daily life further eroded support for the Confederate cause among the civilian population. Impact on slavery and the labor force. The battle and its aftermath had significant implications for the institution of slavery in the region. The disruption of agricultural production and the movement of troops led to the displacement of enslaved people, many of whom sought freedom behind Union lines. This loss of labor further weakened the Confederate war effort and contributed to the erosion of the social order in the South. Long-term strategic implications. Opening the door to the Deep South. The Union victory at Chattanooga, following the Confederate failure to capitalize on their success at Chickamauga, opened the door for Sherman's Atlanta campaign. This campaign, which began in May 1864, ultimately led to the capture of Atlanta in September 1864 and Sherman's subsequent march to the sea. These operations devastated the Confederate heartland and significantly weakened the Southern war effort. Impact on Confederate military strategy. The Battle of Chickamauga and its aftermath forced the Confederacy to reconsider its military strategy. The failure to achieve a decisive victory in the Western Theater highlighted the limitations of the Confederate war effort and led to a shift in focus towards defensive operations. This shift, however, was insufficient to prevent the eventual collapse of the Confederacy. Conclusion. The Battle of Chickamauga was a pivotal moment in the American Civil War, with far-reaching consequences for the Confederacy. While the Confederates achieved a tactical victory, their failure to capitalize on this success had significant long-term implications. The erosion of leadership and morale, the strain on resources, the impact on civilian life, and the strategic setbacks that followed all contributed to the eventual defeat of the Confederacy. The Battle of Chickamauga serves as a stark reminder of the complexities and uncertainties of war, where even a battlefield victory can lead to long-term defeat.